I woke up with a migraine that felt like I'd been drinking jet fuel, and I wasn't even in my own bed. The room was sterile, white tile, flickering overhead light, walls that echoed when I shifted. Hospital? Maybe. But there were no machines beeping, no nurses shuffling past, no one saying my name. Just silence so loud I could hear the electrical hum in the ceiling panels. My first instinct was to check for tubes, wires, anything that would explain why I was lying half-dressed on a gurney. But aside from the hospital gown and some gauze on my left arm, I was clean. No ID, no phone, no watch. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and winced. My muscles were soft, weak, atrophy. I'd been out for a while. There was a chair tipped over beside the wall, and a breakfast tray still sealed in plastic, mold blooming across the applesauce. The timestamp on the yogurt lid said 6 April. It was June now. At least it had been when I last checked. That alone made my stomach twist. I called out, just to hear someone, even a janitor. No answer. My voice felt alien in the space, bouncing back at me like I didn't belong here. The door wasn't locked. I stepped into the hallway, which stretched out in both directions, like a forgotten corridor in a war museum. Fluorescent lights blinked overhead, some dead, others flickering. The smell hit me. Antiseptic clinging to mildew, and something metallic, like blood on rust. The vending machines at the end of the hall were smashed open, empty. A soda can rolled lazily under my foot when I moved. Every nurse's station I passed was vacant, as if they'd all just stepped out for coffee and never came back. One still had a radio left on, battery long dead, with a NHS emergency notice, flyer taped, beside itered ink, screaming, "Stay indoors, avoid contact, do not engage." I didn't know what that meant yet. The first real panic didn't hit until I reached the main entrance. Giant glass doors, motion sensors cracked and dead, just stood there unlocked. Outside was a street, London or something like it. The city skyline in the distance looked right, the Thames barely visible behind a row of evacuated buses. But everything felt off. Trash overflowed from bins. Newspapers tumbled like dry leaves, and not a single person walked the pavement. I stepped out. The air was too quiet. Cities always hum. Traffic, chatter, distant sirens, the clatter of life. This place? Dead still. Even the pigeons seemed to have vanished. There were spray-painted warnings on bus stops, and storefronts read block letters spelling "infected" over and over again. One pub had its windows boarded up, with crosses marked in duct tape. A teddy bear lay in the gutter, with one arm torn off, its glass eye staring skyward. I started walking. Direction didn't matter. I was looking for someone, anyone. Eventually, I found a gas station, or what was left of it. Glass shattered. Shelves raided. A pair of shoes lay by the counter, neatly placed side by side like someone had just stepped out of them. Behind the register, a wall-mounted TV was still frozen on an emergency broadcast. National curfew enacted. Below that, an error screen. I grabbed a bag of dried fruit, still sealed, and ate like I hadn't touched food in days. Probably hadn't. I kept going, zigzagging through streets like I was chasing a ghost. The signs were there. Evacuation orders. Red crosses sprayed on doors. Even a crashed ambulance half wrapped around a streetlight. But no people. Until I saw him. At first, I thought he was drunk. Staggering at the far end of the street, shirt soaked through, arms twitching. Then he stopped, tilted his head, like he sensed me. I stayed frozen. Crouched behind a mailbox, peeking over just enough to watch him jerk forward with that unnatural gait. No hesitation, no speech, just speed. I backed away, trying not to make noise, but it didn't matter. He let out this sound, a guttural, raw burst, like a scream filtered through broken glass, and charged. I ran. My legs didn't care about how weak they were. I vaulted a barricade, shoved open a chain door with rusted hinges, and ducked into what used to be a bank. Inside was a graveyard of sleeping bags and makeshift bedding, all abandoned. I slammed the door shut and jammed a chair beneath the handle. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. Exactly, it was worse than fear. It was knowing that wasn't a person anymore. The sound outside was chaos. The thing threw itself at the door, shrieking like it had been lit on fire. It didn't try to reason, didn't shout words, just kept hammering itself against the frame until I heard a new sound bones, maybe. A few minutes later, silence. I waited, then waited more. When I crept back outside, it was gone. Nothing but the dark smear of something smeared across the pavement where its mouth had been. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of that bank, clutching a length of pipe I'd pulled from the radiator, watching the door. I told myself I'd just keep moving at first light. But even as dawn broke, there was no lightness to it. Just a sun rising over a world that forgot people used to live in it. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. And I wasn't dreaming. I found a phone booth and tried everything. Emergency numbers. 0, 911, even numbers I remembered from when I was a kid. Deadlines. The map in my head was useless here. Every turn I took seemed to lead to another monument to abandonment. A school that had burned halfway down. A library where all the books had been shredded and stacked like barricades. A fountain filled with shoes. And then I found a sign. Evac Point D, Battersea Park. Fresh, painted on a plank of plywood. That meant someone was still trying. I followed it. By the time I reached the park, the sky was already turning bruised purple. Smoke rose from the far end, and I could see floodlights flickering behind a line of cargo trucks and fencing. A gate. A checkpoint. And just past it, human figures. I slowed down as I approached, instincts pulling hard against the surge of hope rising in my chest. My brain wanted to scream, to shout, to call out and let someone know I was alive. But something in the posture of the figures ahead made me hesitate. They weren't moving like soldiers or relief workers. They weren't moving at all. Just silhouettes, still and sharp, standing too close together, as if frozen mid-action. I edged around a broken hedge line, staying low, keeping the cover of a toppled statue and some overgrown shrubs between me and them. Closer now, I could see one of the trucks had a broken mirror dangling off its side, and a coil of barbed wire had been stretched lazily across a gap in the fence. The gate was open, not wide, but just enough to let something slip through. My stomach sank as I realized the ground just inside the checkpoint was streaked dark, not with water, but with dried blood. Thick, trampled paths where something had been dragged. I crouched and watched. The shapes weren't alive. At least, not anymore. They were mannequins, or what was left of them. One had been propped upright in a torn military poncho. Another leaned against a sign that said, "Entry closed until further notice," with duct tape and hand-scrawled writing. The human figures I'd seen from a distance were decoys, distractions. Maybe once meant to comfort or confuse the infected, but now they just stood like macabre reminders of what this place used to be. And it had been used bunk beds stacked in a field tent, now torn and exposed to the weather. Crates of water bottles, half looted, bandages scattered like leaves around a burned-out medical station. No people. Just the aftermath. Still, there were signs of recent activity. A half-buried fire pit with warm ash. A camp chair that hadn't collapsed in on itself yet. Cans with expiration dates that hadn't passed. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. I moved quietly through the remains of the encampment, listening for anything: a cough, a footstep, a whisper, but the wind was the only voice left. Past the trucks, there was a small prefab office cabin, door ajar and swinging gently. Inside, a generator sat gutted and silent, cords trailing off into the mud. One of the walls was covered in maps, London, mostly, with red circles marked around key locations. Hospitals, stadiums, major junctions. Notes scribbled in marker. Secondary breach. Confirmed loss. Hold perimeter. Beneath that, a list of names, maybe a roster. Most were crossed out. Beside a clipboard, I found a radio too lightweight to be military. Civilian band. I turned it on. Static. Then, faintly, a voice, distorted, looping. Shelter no longer active. Repeat. Fall back to Eastbrook Junction. The signal was degrading, caught in a loop, but the name stuck. Eastbrook Junction. I didn't know if that was a person or a place, but it was all I had. I stuffed the radio into a satchel I'd found hanging by the bunk beds, then took anything useful, 2 cans of beans, a utility knife, a small flashlight. I found an old aluminum baseball bat under one of the cots. Heavier than I liked, but it would do. As I was leaving the tent, I caught movement in the corner of my vision. I turned, muscles locked, bat raised, but it wasn't the infected. It was a man, younger than me, maybe 20, crouched beside the far side of the tent, hiding under a stack of tarps. His eyes were bloodshot, but not in that way. Not that twitching madness I'd seen before. Just fear. Pure, human fear. We stared at each other for a moment before he slowly raised his hands and stood. He didn't speak at first, just looked me over like I might vanish if he blinked. Finally, he whispered, "You're not one of them." "No," I said quietly. "I just got here." His name was Callum. He had been part of a group that took shelter here after the city's fall. Most had moved on, weeks ago after a second wave hit. He'd stayed behind waiting for someone. A sister who never came. He told me about the last real supply drop, the food fights, the way the fence gave way after one of the infected got through. It wasn't a horde, just one, but one was enough. The infected didn't need numbers to break you. We talked for a while, whispering in low tones, both of us scanning the edges of the camp every few minutes, like we'd forgotten what it meant to feel safe. He had a wristwatch with a cracked face, but the time still worked. He said it was close to midnight. He hadn't seen another uninfected person in 6 days. When I mentioned the radio broadcast, his eyes lit up. "Eastbrook Junction," he repeated. "That's a train depot. Not far. We used to have a map that showed all the evac points. That was one of them." I wanted to go immediately, but Callum was careful. He said we'd be better off moving at first light, less risk of running into any late-night runners. The infected didn't sleep, but they didn't see as well in the morning haze. If we stuck to the back roads, stayed quiet, and kept our distance from the water line, we had a chance. He had a stash hidden nearby blankets, a few more cans of food, even a flare gun he never dared use. He agreed to share it if I helped him carry supplies. We took turns resting. I watched while he curled up in a corner of the tent, with one hand gripping a wrench like it was a child's toy. When it was my turn, I tried to close my eyes, but all I could see was the face of that thing in the street. Contorted, broken, animal. I couldn't forget the way it moved, how fast it had closed the distance, how completely empty it had looked inside, like the human part had been burned away, leaving only fury behind. When morning came, it was a slow light, diffused through gray clouds. The mist hung low over the park, making the ruined playgrounds and broken lampposts look even more surreal. We packed what we could carry. I took the bat, the knife, and the flashlight. Callum had a fire axe, dull, but better than nothing, and a long scarf he used to wrap his hands and face. The route to Eastbrook wasn't long on the map, but we had to weave through the ruins like rats avoiding open ground. We passed the remains of a department store where the front display had collapsed. Dresses fluttered like ghost limbs in the wind. A wrecked police car leaned against a brick wall, windshield smeared red from the inside. Sirens, long dead. The further we walked, the more we saw signs of panic. Abandoned barricades, overturned shopping carts, doors left swinging on rusted hinges. At one point, we passed a residential block with all the windows shattered outward. Inside, a dining room table still had plates set. No food, just plates, waiting. We didn't speak much. Every sound carried. Once, we heard something clatter in the distance. Maybe a dog, maybe not. We didn't stop to find out. Callum led us down into an old service tunnel that used to run beneath the tram lines. It was damp and smelled like rot, but it got us past the main road without being seen. He lit the path with a cracked headlamp that flickered every few steps. We climbed over rusted pipes and through broken grates until the air started to smell different, sharper, cooler. When we came up on the other side, we were behind a series of loading docks, one of which had the words Eastbrook Logistics spray painted on the wall. The junction was ahead, but so was something else. Callum froze. I stepped up beside him and saw what he was staring at. The loading yard was full, not of trucks or crates, but of bodies, standing, staring at nothing. Infected, dozens of them. Not moving, not attacking, just standing there like a forest of rotting trees. Some twitched slightly, others drooled or jerked their arms like puppets without strings, but none of them were active. Not yet. We ducked back behind a burnt-out van and tried to breathe silently. "What are they doing?" I whispered. Callum didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, he said, "Sometimes they just stop, like they're waiting for something." The radio tower stood behind them, a skeletal structure of metal and wires, blinking faintly in the rising light. Whatever signal had been looping, it came from there. And someone had been there recently. Solar panels were rigged along the rooftop, and a yellow generator box stood nearby, humming faintly. We needed to get through, but there was no obvious path that didn't take us straight into the field of infected. Callum pulled out the flare gun. "No," I said immediately. "Too loud. They'll all follow it." I aim it at the far lot. Give it 10 seconds. Then we run. We don't know how many more are nearby. One sound and this whole place wakes up. He looked at me and nodded slowly, but the way his grip tightened around the flare gun told me he wasn't convinced. He was thinking about his sister, about how close we were to an answer. I didn't blame him, but we needed a plan. I spotted a ladder on the far side of the yard attached to a maintenance shack. If we could get there, we might climb the roof, cross over the containers, and reach the station's edge without stepping into the crowd. It was a gamble, but compared to walking straight into a nest of infected, it felt like a chance we had to take. The shack was about 50 yards from where we crouched, half hidden behind the skeleton of a van whose metal frame had been gnawed at by fire. The air in that moment was thick with a kind of stillness that doesn't feel natural, like a held breath before a scream. Each second felt stretched, fragile, on the verge of collapsing beneath the weight of the next movement. I signaled to Callum, and we moved. Not fast, not slow, just steady, no sudden steps, no scraped soles on concrete. We stayed low and let the surrounding junkyard of metal provide brief pockets of cover as we crossed the edge of the loading yard. The infected stood like statues, many of them locked in place as if waiting for a command that hadn't come yet. Some rocked back and forth, arms twitching, jaws grinding open and shut with soft, wet clicks. One leaned against the side of a truck, leaving a streak of something dark along the aluminum. Another was kneeling, as if stuck mid-fall, its body swaying with an unnatural rhythm. We didn't know what triggered them exactly. Movement, sound, maybe even scent there were theories, but nothing solid. The virus didn't follow consistent logic. It turned people into chaos incarnate. There was no controlling it, only navigating its wake. We were 10 feet from the ladder when everything changed. A broken length of steel pipe, half buried under a tarp, gave way beneath Callum's foot with a muted crunch. It should have been a background sound in the urban decay, but, to the infected, it was thunder. One of them turned, just slightly. Its head jerked up like a bloodhound picking up a fresh trail. Its nose twitched. Then it screamed. Not a human scream, not even an animal's. It was a shriek forged from rage and infection, the raw sound of something unhinged from civilization and memory. The entire yard reacted. The infected burst to life like puppets cut from their strings. They didn't move in unison. They tore in every direction at once, some bolting toward the noise, others slamming into walls, vehicles, even each other. It was a chaos of motion, screams, impacts, and the deafening sound of feet pounding across concrete. There was no warning, no build-up. 1 second we were ghosts, the next we were prey. I grabbed Callum's arm and yanked him toward the ladder. We reached it in seconds that felt like hours. He scrambled up first, his boots clanging against the rusted rungs, while I covered the base with the bat held tight in both hands. One of the infected reached us before I even placed my foot on the first step. A woman, or what had once been a woman, her mouth stretched wide, lips torn, throat vibrating with that awful scream. She lunged, but I ducked and swung upward. The bat connected with her jaw, and the impact was enough to send her off balance. She hit the ground hard but wasn't down for long. I didn't wait to see her rise. I climbed. The ladder shook beneath me. Behind us, more infected reached the base, slamming into each other in a frenzy to get up. Callum was on the roof already, pulling at my arm as I hauled myself up. Just as I cleared the last rung, fingers clawed at my boot, and I kicked free with a desperation I hadn't known I possessed. From the roof of the shack, the yard looked like a swarm of wasps, disturbed mid-hive. The infected writhed below us, crashing into crates and machinery, eyes blazing with an unfocused hate. But they weren't organized. They didn't think in paths. They just reacted. That was the only advantage we had. We sprinted across the corrugated metal, the roof groaning under our weight. Ahead, a series of stacked cargo containers formed a kind of makeshift wall, their flat tops connected by walkways of wood and tarpaulin. It wasn't meant for escape, but maybe for observation. Whoever had been using the station likely used the containers for storage, maybe even makeshift housing. Now they'd be our bridge. We jumped the gap between the shack roof and the first container. Callum landed hard and stumbled, catching himself against the steel wall. I followed, nearly losing my grip on the edge, but he grabbed my wrist and pulled. We kept moving, our boots pounding the top of the containers as the infected below howled and flailed. A few had begun climbing over obstacles now, chasing noise, chasing the idea of us. I didn't know how long we had before they figured out how to reach the top. Halfway across the line of containers, we saw the signal tower. The antenna stood crooked on its support beam, cables dangling like dead vines. At its base, a narrow metal staircase led down into what must have been the control room, for the depot windows shattered, doors forced open. But someone had tried to fortify it, makeshift barricades made of pallets and furniture. It wasn't enough. Blood was sprayed across the doorway in a wide arc. Something had happened there. Recently. We reached the final container and dropped down into the yard behind it. The sound of our landing drew more shrieks. We didn't stop. I led the way to the stairwell and we slipped inside, closing the metal door behind us and jamming it with a pipe. It wouldn't hold forever. Maybe not even a minute. But it would buy time. The inside of the signal room was dim, lit only by slits of daylight through narrow windows. Broken equipment littered the floor, wires pulled from the walls, monitors smashed in frustration or panic. A single portable radio transmitter sat on a table in the corner, connected to a car battery and a solar panel through the window. The light blinked. It was still transmitting. I pressed the play button. Shelter no longer active. Repeat. Fall back to Eastbrook Junction. It looped again. Same message. I looked at Callum. "This is Eastbrook Junction," he said. We stood in the middle of a dead relay. But then I noticed something else. A logbook on the desk, half covered in ash. I opened it. The last entries were dated just 3 days ago. Names, coordinates, supply drop locations, and at the bottom line underlined twice. Signal routed to Redmore facility. Broadcast from there. Repeat only. Callum leaned over my shoulder. Redmore's north. About 5 miles from here. Old train repair yard turned into a security site during the early weeks. Maybe they're still there. It was a possibility. A slim one. But more than we had before. Suddenly, a crash behind us, metal buckling. The infected had reached the staircase. We didn't wait. There was a rear door out of the control room, half blocked by a shelving unit we shoved aside. It opened into a narrow alley between train cars, the walls of the depot echoing every sound we made. We ran, ducking between rusting carriages and skipping over broken rails, the shrieks of the infected close behind us. This wasn't a retreat. This was flight. Callum tripped once, nearly fell, but I caught him by the collar. We kept going until the depot opened into an overgrown rail line leading north. Trees clawed at the edges of the path. Old fences rusted through with age. But for now, silence again. We didn't stop until we'd put a mile between us and the station. Only then did we breathe. Callum dropped to his knees, laughing in that breathless, bitter way people do when they've seen too much and don't know what else to feel. I sat beside him and let the silence settle. A bird called somewhere in the distance, one of the first we'd heard in days. The world felt still again, but it wasn't the comforting kind. It was the silence of being between storms. A lull thick, with the knowledge that something worse was waiting just ahead. The kind of stillness that made your skin tighten, not from fear, but from the instinctive understanding that peace was always borrowed now, never earned. We stayed by the tree line for nearly an hour, long enough for the sweat to cool and our breathing to level out. Neither of us said anything, because there was nothing to be said. The depot had been a Leah signal, looping from a dead station, rerouted from a place neither of us had ever been. Redmore, an old name with no guarantee of meaning anything anymore. But in a world of ghosts and echoes, even a faint trail was better than none. Eventually, Callum stood and stretched his legs. His eyes had that same empty distance I'd seen the first day we met, but now it was sharper, more defined. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was moving with purpose again. I followed him down the slope and into the woods, where the undergrowth swallowed the sound of our steps and the road ahead lay hidden beneath a canopy of skeletal branches. We followed the abandoned tracks north, staying low and off the main line when we could. Redmore, he said, was once a maintenance yard for underground lines that had been extended for military transport during the outbreak. Supposedly fortified, reinforced, even rumored to be a command site in the early days of the evacuation. If anything still operated in this half-dead city, it would be there. That was the story anyway. The route took us through overgrown stations and flooded tunnels. Moss-covered signs with familiar names now looked foreign, like pieces of another reality poking through this one. The trains left behind were gutted, some charred inside, others stripped of copper and steel, their seats sagging with mold and age. We scavenged where we could, finding a few useful things. A sealed first aid tin, a flashlight with weak batteries, and a half-full bottle of water buried in the corner of a collapsed newsstand. Every so often, we found signs of movement-clawed doors, shredded cloth hanging from fences, a streak of blackened blood where something had been dragged. But we didn't see any infected, not for a while. That worried me more than seeing them. It meant they were gathering elsewhere, or worse, learning to move differently. It was late afternoon when we reached the edge of the city proper again. What had once been a bustling intersection near an overpass was now a concrete graveyard. Cars locked in place, some smashed into each other. Others burned hollow with their frames blistered from fire. A lorry had jackknifed across both lanes, spilling crates of what looked like military rations. We approached slowly, weapons in hand. The wrappers were torn open and most of the food gone, but not scattered taken. Someone had been here recently. Callum found a spray-painted marking on the barrier beside the road. 3 vertical lines with a cross through them. He paused, frowning at it. "What's it mean?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the shadows between vehicles. "It's a code, used by scavenger groups, back near the start. The cross means cleared. The lines, group of 3. Probably a team. Small, careful. If they're still alive, they're either lucky or dangerous." We moved through the intersection and followed a narrow service road that curved beneath the overpass. The sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows through the skeletal remains of the city. We needed shelter soon. The infected didn't sleep, but they moved differently at night, more reactive. less predictable, like the dark stripped away even the last fragments of what they used to be. We found an old locksmith shop at the edge of a business strip. The front had been smashed in, but the interior was mostly intact. Shelves of blank keys, tools, and lockboxes. Someone had set up camp here before there was a collapsed cot in the back room, a kettle on a camp stove, and a stack of books that had long since been soaked through. We reinforced the door with a cabinet and wedged a chair under the back exit handle. Then we sat in the dark and waited for the night to pass. The quiet didn't last. It began with a sound soft, inconsistent, a rattle, then a thump. Someone or something testing the door. Not pounding, not shrieking, just tapping, like fingers grazing wood. I held my breath and signaled to Callum, who nodded once and tightened his grip on the axe. The noise continued for a minute, maybe two, then stopped. We waited another hour before moving, afraid that even the smallest sound might draw attention back, but nothing came. The next morning, the street was empty again. No blood, no bodies, just tire tracks we hadn't seen the night before. Faint, but fresh. They pointed toward Redmore. We followed. The closer we got, the more the city changed. It wasn't just decay anymore. It was adaptation. Streets had been blocked off with welded barriers. Windows had been reinforced with sheets of aluminum. Some buildings had entire walls knocked down and repurposed with scaffolding and tarps. It was like a shell of a fortress that had never quite been finished. A safe zone that failed before it could protect anyone. But what stood out most were the sign-shan-painted wooden boards nailed to streetlights, fences, trees. All of them said the same thing. Turn back, Redmore is closed. We ignored them. Redmore itself didn't look like much at first. Just a stretch of reinforced rail yard on the far side of a shallow canal, half ringed by concrete walls and fences layered with barbed wire. But as we approached the outer perimeter, we saw the towers. Not military improvised. Shipping containers stacked into lookouts. Searchlights, long dead, mounted on corners. A heavy steel gate blocked the access road. A checkpoint booth stood beside it. Roof collapsed inward from some long-forgotten impact. There were no guards, no lights, no voices. Just a line of bones near the fence, laid out in a perfect row. Cleaned, arranged, deliberate. Callum froze when he saw them. This wasn't the infected, he said quietly. This was people. People who made a point. We searched the outer yard and found no signs of recent activity. The front gate was locked, but a service hatch near the east wall had been pried open from the inside. We squeezed through into a utility corridor and emerged behind a warehouse. The interior was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the entire compound was holding its breath. Inside the building, rows of crates and equipment lined the floor. Medical supplies, expired rations, chemical drums with fading hazard labels. A few had been smashed. Others opened, stripped of anything useful. We kept moving deeper, searching for signs of life. Redmore, it seemed, had once been something impressive. Wide bunkers, fortified entry points, rows of tents, and modular shelters. But something had happened here, something more than abandonment. Every surface was stained with soot and soot mixed with something darker. Most of the equipment had been sabotaged, not just damaged. Consoles opened, and wires yanked free. Radios smashed with tools. Even the solar panels on the upper levels had been cracked, intentionally. Someone had made sure this place could never function again. And then we heard it. A faint noise. Footsteps. Real ones. We ducked behind a collapsed curtain wall and waited. The steps moved slowly, cautiously. Not the chaotic thrashing of the infected. Someone still alive. Callum gripped his axe tighter and peeked around the corner. A woman. Mid-30s, rail-thin, dressed in a patchwork of military and civilian clothing. She held a crowbar low by her side and moved with practiced tension. When she saw us, she didn't scream, didn't speak. She just raised her free hand, palm out, and held it steady. We stepped out slowly. Her name was Shay. She'd been with the original Redmore team back when this place still meant something. Now she was the only one left. The others were either gone or worse. She led us into one of the reinforced shelters and told us the story. Redmore had fallen from the inside, not to the infected, but to its own paranoia. Supplies ran low, people turned on each other, and leadership fractured. Someone started sabotaging the systems. Not infected, just angry. Angry and desperate. Eventually, when a runner got in and infected 2 guards, it was the excuse they needed. They locked the gates. Everyone inside was condemned. Shay had survived by staying out of sight, hiding in maintenance ducts, and crawling through forgotten service hatches. She'd been alone for weeks. The signal we heard? She'd reconnected a looping message in hopes someone might come. But the truth was, she no longer believed rescue was coming. You could hear it in her voice, no resignation, but a hardened steadiness, like someone who had long stopped counting days. Her face, gaunt and weathered, carried that distant, quiet look of someone who had buried too many people and run out of reasons to expect more. She took us deeper into Redmore that night, not just the crumbling courtyards and empty supply buildings, but into the lower levels, the places she called the quiet floors. These were the original service tunnels, long predating the outbreak, built when the facility had been part of London's old maintenance grid. She had rigged several of the rooms with crude traps pressure triggers and noise, alarms using parts scavenged from fuse boxes and broken floodlights. Down here, the infected didn't roam often. But she didn't trust them to stay out forever. She didn't trust anything to last forever. We found a room with 2 cots and a bolted door, lit by the flicker of a single solar lantern hanging from a pipe overhead. For the first time in days, I slept. It wasn't deep or peaceful, but it was real undisturbed hours that passed in something like rest. When I woke, the world hadn't changed, but the sharp edge of exhaustion had dulled just enough to think clearly again. Shay sat by the corridor, eating the last of a tin of beans with her fingers. She handed us what was left barely. 2 spoonfuls sand, said nothing. Callum took it, nodded once, and passed the remainder to me. No one spoke about fairness. Fairness had been buried long ago. Later that morning, Shay showed us the central command room, the heart of Redmore, a windowless steel box beneath the southern quarter of the facility. Cracked monitors lined the walls, their dead screens reflecting the clutter of overturned chairs and disassembled keyboards. A map had been painted onto the concrete wall in white and red, a simplified depiction of Greater London. Most of it was marked with X's, or blacked out completely. Shay stood beside it, pointing out each quadrant. This area's gone. No movement, no survivors. Same with the South Bank line, flooded and overrun, she explained. Camden reported lights 2 months ago, but I haven't heard a broadcast since. North is unstable, some kind of barricaded colony, trying to hold out, but the signal's erratic. Callum asked the question we were both thinking, is there anywhere left? Shay pointed to a patch of blue near the edge of the map, barely marked. West. Near the old airfield. RAF Chilton. Off-grid, isolated. If anything survived the collapse, it'd be there. That name meant nothing to me. Not in this world. But Shay said she'd picked up a fragment of transmission weeks ago, something coded. Military. Just a frequency. Short and cut off. It didn't repeat. But she'd written it down, just in case. We didn't argue. When the world collapses, you don't chase certainty. You chase anything that hasn't said no yet. We stayed in Redmore for 2 more days, long enough to rest, recover, and help Shay reinforce the perimeter, what little remained of it. We scavenged usable wire and steel poles to strengthen the east gate and set up a warning system with cans and wire across the inner corridors. Shay had lived alone for so long that working beside us almost seemed alien to her. She wasn't cold, just practiced, like someone who had learned the hard way that getting too close meant losing too much. But something shifted between us during that time. Not trust exactly, but something adjacent. When we sat in the shelter together at night, watching the single lantern flicker, There was a kind of unspoken agreement. If we were going to die, it wasn't going to be in this room. Waiting for another flare that never came. We'd die moving. On the third morning, we prepared to leave. Shay packed her kit with the calm of someone who never unpacked too far to begin with. She brought a crowbar, a small sidearm with 5 rounds, and a pack of iodine tablets. Callum tightened the straps on his makeshift pack and slipped the fire axe into a sheath he'd rigged from leather and canvas. I took the bat and the utility knife, now dulled at the tip. There was a silence as we stood at the edge of the gate. Not hesitation. Just that pause, the last inhale, before stepping into something that might be your final corridor. The road west was longer than any we'd taken before. Redmore had been isolated for a reason. Beyond its walls, the city had fallen into deep neglect. The streets were impassable in places, littered with overturned trucks, burned-out wrecks, and collapsed infrastructure. Bridges sagged from fire damage, and entire buildings leaned into one another like tired men waiting for the end. We moved fast, traveling in the early hours and before dusk, resting in secure basements and alleyways during the peak daylight. The infected were more active in open light, now drawn to heat or sound, maybe both. Their patterns weren't logical, but their presence was constant. On the third day, we passed what used to be a supermarket distribution center. The inside had been stripped clean. No supplies, no bodies. But the walls were covered in messages, hundreds of them, written in soot, blood, marker, chalk. Some were names, some were prayers. Most were curses. One sentence was painted large across the receiving bay wall. It was never a flu. No one said anything after that. By the time we reached the boundary of what Shay believed was Chilton's perimeter, we were running low on food, nearly out of water, and running on fumes. The road that led toward the airfield had been cut off by a deliberate barricade trucks, stacked, welded shut, and layered with old netting. But the real defense was further in. Tripwires, caltrops, alarm snares. Someone had put real work into keeping people outer, at least knowing when they arrived. We approached with care, hands open, weapons visible but lowered, and we waited. It didn't take long. The voice came through a speaker, buried in the brush. "Stop where you are. Identify yourselves. You have 10 seconds. Shay stepped forward, gave her name, her Redmore tag, and the frequency code she'd heard. Silence followed. Then the gate cracked open, just enough for a man in a respirator and patched fatigues to emerge. He looked us over for a long time, then motioned us forward. One at a time, we stepped through the gap and into the camp. Inside was a different world. Chilton had held. Somehow, crude, efficient shelters lined the interior perimeter, guarded by tripods with mounted lights and hand-cranked alarms. People, real people, walked between buildings with purpose, carrying tools, crates, food. Not a city, not a government, just survivors, hardened, cautious, alive. They didn't greet us with smiles. They didn't ask where we came from. They asked if we were infected, searched our gear, and separated us for evaluation. That was the cost of entry. They had protocols, quarantine zones, medical screening. Everyone earned their place. No one was owed anything. I was placed in temporary isolation for 2 days. In that time, I learned more from overheard conversations and clipboard charts than I did from any formal briefing. The rage virus hadn't burned out. It had mutated slightly, no longer killing the infected in weeks, but sustaining them longer. Those infected in the early days died fast, burned up by the fury. But now, the ones who turned were lasting longer. Some began to stalk, hide, hunt. They weren't zombies. They weren't mindless. They were rage, given Legson now, patience. After clearance, I reunited with Callum and Shay in the central compound. We didn't embrace. That wasn't how this place worked. But we nodded, and that was enough. We worked. That's how we repaid our place. I helped with wiring and communications, using what little I'd learned patching broken systems at Redmore. Callum assisted in salvage runs. Shay took night patrols, where the real threats lived. Every day was a risk, but it wasn't hopeless. Not here. Still, I couldn't sleep. Some nights, I'd wake and walk the fence line, staring out into the dark where the silence pressed hardest. One evening, I saw a shape at the far tree line, not moving, just watching. It never stepped forward. It never charged. It simply stood there, as if it had learned that not all prey needed to run. Weeks passed, maybe months. I stopped counting. The camp grew, lost people, gained new ones. But the virus didn't leave. It waited, changed, learned. The silence we used to fear now came with a different edge. The infected didn't scream as often anymore. We used to hear them at night howling from the hills or tearing through the underbrush in wild packs so loud it sounded like the world was being shredded just beyond the tree line. But lately, there was quiet. The kind that sinks in too deep, settles in your chest and makes your breath feel loud. It wasn't peace. It was something else. Chilton had survived by staying hidden. No flares, no broadcasts, no long-range expeditions. Every movement out beyond the perimeter was fast, quiet, and rarely repeated. Our signal was buried under a dozen layers of analog misdirection, bounced through dying towers, and buried beneath noise. The people here weren't rebuilding. They were enduring. You could feel it in the way they moved, the way they spoke. It was all function. Even meals were quiet. No one talked about the old world anymore. That had passed. Conversation was about wind direction, water filters, the strength of new barricades. I was put on perimeter duty 3 weeks into my stay. Patrol rotations during daylight, fence checks at dusk, and occasionally night watch on the northwest tower, which overlooked the old airfield's derelict runway. From up there, you could see the forest pressing in like a rising tide. The trees bent in unnatural ways, not because of wind, but from years of weight vines, rot, bodies. We spotted a movement on the third day of that watch. Not a group, just one figure. He emerged from the tree line on the far edge of the tarmac, walking with that stuttering, stilted motion we'd learned to fear. But he didn't run. He didn't scream. He stopped at the same distance every night, just far enough to make out his shape. Not his face, just the way he tilted his head slowly, like a dog working out a sound. Then he'd turn, retreat into the woods, and vanish until the next dusk. He did this for 6 nights. We stopped calling it patrol. We called it observing. The 7th night, he didn't come alone. At first, it was subtle. Shadows moving differently. Brush bending under weight, not wind. Then we saw the glint of eye stew. Then 4. Then more, catching the moonlight like shattered glass. They were crouched low, waiting. No snarling, no flailing. Waiting. That was new. I reported it to Breck, the lead on security. He listened, nodded, and made a mark in his notebook. No panic, no alarm raised. Just a note. Observed Group 6 activity. Then he said something I didn't understand at the time. They're starting to recon. We didn't sleep that night. Half the camp stayed up, rotating shifts, weapons loaded but quiet. Not a single infected crossed the perimeter. Not that night. Not the next. But things changed. We started finding signs around the outskirts. Small ones. Markings carved into trees, not symbols, just gouges. Some shallow, some deep. Others were clawed into the dirt near the fence, in crescent patterns, like something had crawled under the wire, and back out again. The dogs rescued mutts that served more as alarms than pets refused to go near the southern edge. One of them bit its own leash in half just to avoid the gate. Then the snare line failed. We had set up a ring of tin can alarms along the western sector, low-tech, but reliable. You don't need sensors when metal on string clatters loud enough to wake the whole camp. That morning we found the line intact. The cans were gone. Every one. Not ripped down. Removed. Carefully. Silently. Shay came to me that evening, face darker than I'd ever seen. She didn't speak at first. just handed me an old Redmore logbook of the ones I hadn't read yet. Inside were sketches and descriptions from the last 2 weeks of the facility, written by a corporal who'd survived longer than most. His entries started like the rest reports of dwindling food, morale, and attacks. But the final pages were different. He described watching the infected for days, noting changes. One relearned how to climb. Another waited for patrols to pass before moving. The last entry was short. Some of them don't scream anymore, they just look at you and wait. It's not rage, it's strategy. Shay had kept that to herself for months. Now she didn't have to. Chilton started digging in. Harder. We doubled shifts, reburied our signal cables, moved all sleeping quarters further from the fence. Spotlights were reinstalled with backup hand cranks. Silent alarms were fitted along tunnels we hadn't used in months. We even stopped using the cook fires. Meals went cold. We stopped showing light after dark. 3 days later, we lost contact with the Northern Scout Party. 3 men, all veterans. Their final radio ping was 2 clicks out from the hillside range, on a route they'd taken twice a week for months. When they didn't return by nightfall, no one was sent after them. Not at first. Everyone knew what it meant. By morning, their gear was left stacked outside the gate. Not damaged, not bloodied. Stacked. The way someone who remembered how we honored the dead might have done it. Their weapons were gone. That's when people started whispering about the new ones. Not the sprinting monsters that charged and flailed like animals. These didn't act like that. These were something else. Rage that had cooled, calcified, twisted into something that didn't just lash out, it watched. It learned. We started calling them quiet men. Not because they looked different, but because they behaved like shadows, pretending to be people. They could stalk a path for days without making a sound. They didn't swarm. They singled out, one at a time. We saw them more often now, always at dusk, never screaming. The psychology of the camp cracked around the edges. Some wanted to flee, head west beyond the ruins and into the forest. Others said we had to strike first, go out and burn whatever was watching us before it made its move. Shay disagreed with both. She believed in waiting, learning. She thought Chilton had one advantage left: knowledge. We'd adapted to madness. But could we adapt to method? I wasn't sure. I started writing again, not for anyone else, just for myself. Pages scrawled into ration packaging, cardboard, whatever I could find. I documented behavior, patterns, shadows seen and heard but never confirmed. I logged where I saw the same figure, always near the old aircraft hangars, always at the same time. It wore the same coat each time, or what looked like a coat, blackened and stiff with grime. One arm hung strange, like it had broken and never healed right. It never ran, never spoke. One night, I stayed in the tower after my shift ended, just to watch. It stepped out at exactly 2:11. This time, it walked to the center of the tarmac. Full moon above. I could see every detail: patches of hair, torn pants, barefoot. It looked straight at me. I was sure of it. Then it did something no infected had ever done. It raised its hand, palm out, and held it there. I froze, didn't raise my weapon, didn't move. It stayed like that for 20 seconds. Then it dropped its hand, turned its back to me, and walked away without hesitation. No sound, no sudden lunge, no erratic twitching. Just a steady gait that disappeared into the forest, like fog fading at first light. I stayed up in the tower for another hour, trying to make sense of it. My grip on the railing had left my fingers raw, but I didn't notice until much later. I wasn't afraid in the traditional sense. I'd seen too much for fear to hit like it used to. This was different. Something colder. The kind of realization that doesn't come with panic but with clarity. That infected wasn't wild. It wasn't confused. It had purpose. Recognition. And worst of all, it was waiting. The next morning I kept quiet. I didn't know what to say. or if saying it would change anything. Maybe it was a trick. Maybe it was the beginning of something more. But by the time I made my way to the central block for the daily equipment check, I already knew I wasn't the only one who'd seen it. 2 other perimeter guards were talking in hushed tones beside the weapons shed. One described a man standing in the road just before dawn. He hadn't moved toward the fence, but he hadn't run either. Just stood, hands down, eyes wide, as if waiting for a signal. Another claimed to have seen the same figure 3 nights Agorite before the tin can alarm line had failed again. No one called it in. Not because they didn't believe what they saw, but because they did. I didn't speak. I just listened. Then I walked the perimeter in silence, taking the long way around to avoid the northwest tower and the growing throb in the back of my head. When I got back to my bunk, I found a piece of folded canvas tucked under my gear roll. A message scrawled in thick charcoal across the fabric. "We are not alone anymore." I knew the handwriting. Shay. I found her at dusk, by the back scaffolding near the fuel dump, where she sometimes repaired gear in peace. She didn't look up when I approached, just kept stripping the casing from a busted comm relay. "You saw it too," I said. She nodded once. 3 nights ago. Same pattern, same posture, same quiet. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I didn't need to. Everyone already knows." There was no fear in her voice. Only exhaustion. Not the kind you sleep off, but the kind that creeps into your bones and convinces you some wars aren't meant to be won just weathered. She told me about something she hadn't shared before. Back at Redmore, in the final days, just before everything fell apart, one of their scouts had reported seeing a group of infected doing something strange. They weren't attacking. They were circling a small building, pacing, slowly, strategically, like wolves testing the limits of a den. The scout never made it back to confirm what happened next. The next patrol found his radio, still transmitting static, and a circle of blood-stained stones placed where the doorway had been. "They're not just reacting anymore," Shay said. "They're communicating, or something close to it." I didn't have words for what that meant. Neither did she. That night, Chilton's walls went darker than ever before. Lights off, no movement. Even the watchtowers operated without their usual signals. For the first time, silence was part of our defense. The perimeter went dead to all but internal routes, and we kept firelight to a minimum. Whatever was watching us, whether it was the same figure from the runway or a dozen more like it, had changed the rhythm of the camp. We were no longer just surviving an outbreak. We were being observed. The pattern continued for days. Every dusk, 1 or more of them would appear at the edges of the forest. Always the same distance. Always standing just long enough to be seen, then vanishing into the shadows. No attempts to breach, no attacks. But their presence changed everything. Patrols were doubled. Food rations tightened to preserve strength. The medic station began preparing triage protocols again. People weren't just preparing for attack, they were preparing for siege. Then the pattern broke. On the 9th night, no one appeared. The forest was empty. No movement, no eyes, just trees. The kind of stillness that feels wrong. And in the morning, the southern trip line was found untouched. But the line of tin cans had been moved, not taken, not broken. Rearranged into a perfect circle. Shay called it a message. Breck, our head of security, didn't agree. He believed it was psychological warfare. Something to make us paranoid, make us question our routines. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. The infected we once knew didn't operate like this. Their minds had burned out fast pure fury, pure instinct. This was different. This was structure. Deliberate action. The virus hadn't just mutated the body. It had found a way to burrow into behavior, into memory. On the 12th day, one of the outer barricades was breached. Not violently. The gate had been unbolted. Carefully. No damage to the hinges. No broken locks. Just opened. That night, we found another mark scratched into the concrete behind the gatepost. 3 vertical lines. 1 horizontal slash. The symbol Callum and I had seen at the junction. The same one I'd seen near the watchtower. Shay called a meeting. Only 9 of us were present, people she trusted. People who had seen what she had. She laid it all out. The signs, the changes in behavior, the silence, the pattern. And then she asked the question no one wanted to answer. What if we're not dealing with infection anymore? What if we're dealing with evolution? It was a theory none of us wanted to believe. Not because it was outlandish, but because it made too much sense. The infected we had been fighting all this time weren't mindless anymore. They weren't just attacking. They were planning. We had become part of their process, not prey. Opponents. 2 days later, the fences held. But the solar array was taken out, not destroyed, dismantled. Each panel unbolted, left in a neat stack. No sign of who did it, no footprints, no struggle. That was the final warning. The next night, Shay left. She didn't tell anyone officially. She just packed her gear, left me her crowbar, and walked out through the west tunnel before curfew. I didn't chase her. I understood. Some fights aren't meant to be waited for. Some people need to walk into the dark on their own terms. Callum stayed. He took over night watch rotation on the southeast wall and kept a quiet log of every movement in the woods. He stopped speaking much. None of us did. I've written all of this down now because I don't know how much longer this pattern will continue. There are fewer of us than there were. People disappear, sometimes gone by morning, sometimes just not at their post. Always without struggle. No blood, no sounds, just absence. Like something had studied us long enough to know when we're weakest. Maybe that's the future of this place. Not war. Erasure. No invasion. Just removal. One night at a time.